Okay, so my talk is on glyphosate, and I think all of you know what glyphosate is. Is that right? Great. I was excited to see this article appear in the New York Times just a few days ago because the mainstream has been very slow to adopt this point of view. And these two people who wrote this article said the GMO experiment, carried out in real time and with our entire food and ecological system as its laboratory, is perhaps the greatest case of human hubris ever. It creates yet another systemic, too big to fail enterprise, but one for which no bailouts will be possible when it fails. Okay, so here's where we're going with my talk. I'll have an introduction first, and then I'm going to talk specifically about glyphosate and manganese, which I think is a crucial part of how glyphosate causes harm, and also linked to autism. I'm going to talk about the gut microbes and how glyphosate disrupts them and how that can lead to obesity and other kinds of problems. I'm going to talk about cancer. I'm going to talk about other species in stress besides humans, what we can anticipate looking forward if we stay the course, and then finally taking action. I'm going to try to put a little more time into taking action because we've got a lot of movement going on. I'm very excited about different ways that people are trying to make the change that we need to get past this phase in human history where we're all being poisoned. So, introduction. U.S. makes up 5% of the world's population and consumes more than 50% of the world's pharmaceutical drugs. We spend more on healthcare than Japan, France, China, UK, Italy, Canada, Brazil, Spain, and Australia combined. We rank last or near last among the developed nations on infant mortality and on life expectancy. And we also suffer from many chronic diseases. And we consume 25% of the world's glyphosate supply. I think these are directly connected. This is a book that I highly recommend. I just finished reading it, and I don't read many books, so this is really gripping. He did a great job. This is Stephen Drucker, and he's showing much of what Judy talked about, how reckless they are in introducing all of these genetically engineered crops, and how their science is so inadequate to show that these crops are actually safe. And so these institutions have systematically contorted this truth to conceal the risks for over 30 years. And here's a quote from the very end of his book, the last paragraph in his book: "We don't need new laws, we don't need new research, we just need new awareness. All that's required is for a few key people, or enough people in general, to learn the basic facts. And when that happens, as it is bound to, it will bring the fact-averse GE food venture to an end." And I think that's a great quote, and I think that's what we need. We need to work this grassroots from public awareness. Everybody who knows needs to tell everybody they know, get this message out, and get the change implemented. We can't rely on the governments to do it for us. This is what scared me, and this is what started me looking into autism. This is a plot of the trends in autism in the United States, going back to 1975. 1975 was when glyphosate was introduced into the food chain. And the autism rates have been going up ever since. They've been going up exponentially. This is an exponential curve. And so what we don't also realize is that those kids who are showing the 1 in 68, which is the most recent number, those are kids who were 12 years old when they measured it. So you've got to move another 12 years into the future to see what's happening to kids being born today. And so we need to plot this thing up and see where is it going to be in 12 years. You can actually take a log. If it's an exponential growth, you'll get a straight line. This is a very good model, a straight line. You can extend that line into the future, and you can ask, when will we have half the children born end up on the autism spectrum? The answer is 2032. Very, very soon. And if this happens, this country is no longer going to be great. We're going to spend all of our time taking care of those autistic kids. So we need to do something, and we need to do something fast. Why? That was my big question, and I looked at a lot of things over the course of 8 years. 5 years of seeking, I was still stumped. And then it was when I heard Don Huber talk, as Melissa said, Don Huber gave me the answer, because he showed all the things that glyphosate was causing to human health, and those were the things that I knew were happening in autism, and I didn't understand what was causing them. It was a perfect match. This is RoundUp, and you can go buy it at your hardware store, put it on the weeds in your yard. Nobody's going to stop you. You can even do it carelessly without worrying about the fact that your child's right next to you. This needs to change. That's what the molecule looks like. And here's a plot of the trend of autism. If you look in first grade, you can look at the actual statistics of how many kids are diagnosed with autism according to this benefit program in the US in first grade. And you get this, the blue boxes. And then you can look at how much glyphosate was used on corn and soy crops over the previous 4 years. That's the red line. And those guys are perfectly matched. 0.9972 correlation coefficient. Exactly tracking the same trend. Glyphosate is everywhere throughout our food chain, in our food and water. The lack of data on toxicity of glyphosate is not proof of safety, and these herbicides cannot be considered safe without proper testing. We know Roundup contains many other chemicals which, when mixed together, are 1,000 times more toxic than glyphosate on its own. So this is another issue. They test it in isolation as glyphosate. They use it in the formulation where they put all kinds of extra stuff in there to make it better able to kill the weeds. Well, no surprise, it also makes it better able to harm our own health. So, main toxic effects of glyphosate. It kills the beneficial bacteria in your gut. It's been patented as an antibiotic, antimicrobial agent. So what happens is it kills the good guys and allows the pathogens to grow, and that causes all kinds of gut problems, which the autistic kids often suffer from. It interferes with a very important class of enzymes in the liver called the cytochrome P450 enzymes. You can call them CYP enzymes for short. They do many, many things that are important for your body's health. One of which is to detoxify other toxic chemicals. So by virtue of not having them working, everything else that you're exposed to becomes more toxic because the liver can't break it down. It chelates minerals. It hides these minerals so that your body doesn't have access to them. Things like iron and cobalt and manganese, which play a very important role in enzyme activities in your body and many other things. It interferes with the synthesis of a very important class of molecules which are called the aromatic amino acids, and those are precursors to all kinds of other important molecules in your body. So those are going to also be depleted because of the effect of glyphosate on that pathway. And it also depletes methionine, which is the core of the sulfur system, which is really, really important for your body's health. So therefore, it disrupts sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport. And I've actually identified sulfate deficiency as a key driver behind many modern diseases that we're suffering from. These are just some of the nutrients, hormones and neurotransmitters that are disrupted by glyphosate. And some of them are disrupted because they are products of that shikimate pathway. That's true for folate and vitamin K. And vitamin A. Vitamin D is, it needs those CYP enzymes in the liver, so we have an epidemic in vitamin D deficiency. The aromatic amino acids I mentioned, and the methionine, the various minerals that get chelated, serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, and epinephrine. These are all really, really important neurotransmitters that are products of that shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. They come from those aromatic amino acids. And also melanin does, and also thyroid hormone. And people have a lot of issues with thyroid these days. Part of that is probably because of their lack of adequate supply of thyroid, of the precursors to make the thyroid hormone. And then these other two things, NAD and glutathione, are all really important antioxidant defenses that are depleted by glyphosate. Glyphosate's ability to interfere with, to act as an antibiotic, causes it to lead to antibiotic resistance. And this is something that's shown in 2 recent papers, one of which showed that when you expose pathogens to low-dose antibiotic for over a long period of time, they become able to quickly become resistant to other antibiotics, different ones. And then the other paper showed that glyphosate could do that. So in other words, the first one theoretically said yes, it should be able to. The second one said yes, it does. When the microbes are exposed to glyphosate, they become resistant to things like penicillin, and you get, these MRSA with this, multiple resistant Staph aureus. You get C. difficile, C. diff, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. All these microbes that are causing so much trouble in the hospital could be due to the fact that we're being chronically exposed to a low-grade antibiotic through the diet. This just shows that the CYP enzymes are in trouble with glyphosate, and there's glyphosate. These boxes are the amount of decrease in the amount of CYP enzyme activity in the liver for a variety of different other chemicals that glyphosate is being compared to, such as 2,4-D. And glyphosate was obviously by far the most effective at reducing the activity of these CYP enzymes among these things that were compared. Kidney disease is something that we're facing an epidemic in. And workers in sugarcane fields in Central America, and also rice paddies in Sri Lanka, are dying at a young age from kidney failure. And there have been studies done in Sri Lanka that have shown that all the evidence points to glyphosate as causing these problems. It's working synergistically with arsenic in the soil and with the drinking water that might be contaminated with nitrogen oxide. So glyphosate is working again with other poisons synergistically to cause increased harm, and then causing things like kidney failure. And as a consequence of this knowledge, Sri Lanka and El Salvador have both banned glyphosate. They won't use it even for commercial applications, which is really great that these two countries have taken a stand. So manganese, this is really quite a striking plot that I saw when Professor Huber gave his talk. He showed this. And this shows how glyphosate disrupts the mineral supplies to the plants. So you have Fe is iron, Mn is manganese, Zn is zinc, three very important minerals to both the plants and to the humans. The left-hand side shows the root uptake, and the right-hand side shows how much gets into the shoots of the plant. And you can see that the big boxes are how much in the control, and then everything is being depleted, particularly here in the shoot. So the minerals are not being taken up by the plant. This is going to cause harm to the plant, but also it's going to mean that when you eat the food from that plant, you're going to get mineral deficiency. And notice particularly the manganese, which is the one that I focused on. Anthony Samsel and I wrote a whole paper recently on manganese and glyphosate, where we found an amazing number of things, again, that could explain in particular autism, but many other conditions on the basis of this problem with manganese. This shows, and this is why we wrote this paper, we saw this paper by Margaret Kruger in Germany, in Europe. They did this study, and they looked at cows being fed GMO Roundup Ready feed, and they looked at the different minerals in their blood to see what was deficient, and they found two that were extremely deficient: cobalt and manganese. And cobalt, of course, is what you need for cobalamin, and cobalamin is B12, and a lot of people have issues with B12 deficiency. Manganese was, in both of these, cobalt and manganese were far below. This is 8 different farms, and the numbers you can't even see up here, but these little tiny boxes are what they measured in the blood. This is the minimum that you would expect in the range, and that's the maximum. So everything is way below the minimum expected value of manganese in the blood in these cows. So this made us think maybe humans are having the same problem. And in fact, we're finding that from studies on children with autism. We've seen now studies that show in the teeth, in the urine, and in the blood, all showing deficiencies in manganese in these autistic kids. This study looked at lead, mercury, and manganese, and the only one that it found, looking at the baby teeth after they came out and examining these contents, and the only thing they found was that the manganese was down by 60% in the teeth in these autistic kids. So here's the paper that Anthony and I published in 2015, this year in March. And this is open access, so you can go, you don't have to pay a lot of money to read it. And we went through all the different possibilities of how the manganese deficiency would impact health and came up with a long list. These are some of the things that we found. Manganese disruption leads to disrupted gut bacteria because lactobacillus actually really critically depends on manganese. And that's the first bacterium that needs to get settled in the gut when the child is born. That's the one that you have milk for lactobacillus. When they are deficient, then you have anxiety, and anxiety is also a problem that we're seeing increasing even in our children, and is linked to autism. Dopamine synthesis, it depends on manganese also, and insufficient dopamine will lead to thyroid disease. Glutamate and ammonia both become toxic, develop to toxic levels in the brain when manganese is deficient. Mitochondrial control of oxidative damage depends upon manganese. Mitochondria are the energy factories of the cell, where glucose is turned into sugars, turned into energy. That gets disrupted. That's also a feature of autism. Bones don't develop properly. They need manganese to develop. You get into osteoporosis, which is also an epidemic today in elderly people. And then you have these perineuronal nets, which are likely to be important for autism, that don't get developed properly because of the lack of manganese. So you can see many, many things get in trouble with manganese deficiency. And it's not just deficiency. What we found is really interesting is that ordinarily manganese in the liver is sent back to the gut attached to bile acids. And then it's distributed to the whole body from the gut to the rest of the system through the blood. But what happens is that glyphosate disrupts the ability for the bile to flow, and that's partly because of the CYP enzyme problem that it introduces. And therefore, what happens is that the manganese actually travels along the vagus nerve and goes to the brainstem and accumulates there. So you get too much manganese in the stem of your brain and too little manganese in the rest of your body, including your cortex. So you've got a huge imbalance of where the manganese is, and this gives you various kinds of problems both ways. So what I think is that, in fact, I can describe sort of now at a high level 4 different diseases, the young, old, autism versus ADHD among the young. ADHD is, of course, another disease that's epidemic right now. And then Alzheimer's versus Parkinson's disease in the elderly, that are based on just this balance between iron and manganese. When there's too much iron, you end up with autism and Alzheimer's, and when there's too much manganese, you end up with ADHD and Parkinson's. And the problem is that glyphosate messes up your body's ability to handle these 2 minerals correctly. And so everybody's walking a tightrope between deficiency and toxicity for the minerals, and they can't get the amount right. And so here's a quote from a paper: "Our love-hate relationship with iron is the cost we incur to have an aerobic metabolism." What that means is that we need the iron in order to be able to metabolize sugar. If there's insufficient iron, we suffer loss of function, but if there's too much, or the control and repair mechanisms are defective, we suffer damage. And the problem is that glyphosate makes those control and repair mechanisms defective. So dementia and autism have a lot in common, and they also match. Dementia matches glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops just about as well as autism does. Also becoming an epidemic, and it's going to be a huge problem as the baby boomers age in this society. Gut microbes, my next topic, gut microbes and obesity. Is glyphosate making us obese? Our microbes outnumber our own cells by a factor of 10, and their genome outnumbers our genome by a factor of 100. So they have we have only 1% of the genome that's actually in our body. That's where the code is for all the proteins that are made. So they are very special for us, and they can do a lot of things we can't do. So glyphosate causes this imbalance in the gut microbes, and the pathogens release toxic phenols, which can lead to inflammatory bowel disease, and that can then be a direct path to obesity. And people have shown that you can take gut microbes from an obese human, you can put them into a mouse, and that mouse will become fat. So it really points to the gut microbes as being the source of the obesity. We have more than 2/3 of our adults are now overweight or obese, and it's linked to a number of chronic health conditions like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and arthritis. This is a plot of obesity over time, and they went back to 1700, and they were looking at sugar, and they were proposing that sugar might be the reason for the obesity. But in fact, glyphosate is a much better match. Glyphosate was introduced in 1975. You can see we were getting fatter. The obesity curve, we were getting fatter, and we hit 1975, and we shot straight up. We started getting fatter faster. And I think glyphosate is the core component of that, that's causing that metabolism to cause us to hoard fat and to overeat. This is a curve of death where obesity was indicated as the cause of death, and this also shows a fairly good match. This is going from around 1996 is where this curve starts to take off, and going up like this. The red is the glyphosate usage, and the blue is the GMO, the introduction of the GMO corn and soy crops. So we've been changing all of our corn and soy into GMO over the course of this time period, starting around 1996, at the same time as we've been using more and more glyphosate on those crops. And the obesity deaths matches well between those, sandwiched between those two curves. So how could glyphosate cause obesity? I've been thinking about this problem. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but one thing is that because it disrupts the liver's ability to detoxify organic pollutants, then what happens is that those things can be stuffed into those fat cells to get them out of the way so they won't cause harm to things like the brain. And so getting fat might be a practical way to store those toxins that you can't get rid of. And another possibility is the gut microbes so the gut microbes actually convert the sugar into fat and provide that fat, and that's why you get this sort of abdominal obesity. they're producing that fat and providing it, and you're putting that toxin right in there instead of having, because you can't break it down. And glyphosate also depletes serotonin. That's a product of the sucralmate pathway. And serotonin has been shown to suppress appetite. So people have talked about serotonin deficiency being linked to getting fat through the regulatory control of the brain. I have been studying kwashiorkor recently, a very interesting disease in Africa. It's called a nutritional deficiency disease. It's very prevalent in Malawi, Africa. And that is the only country in the world where the staple diet is GM Roundup Ready maize, which is corn. And these victims have a lot of interesting pathologies in their development. You can see this picture here, and they have these big bellies, which are mostly water. They retain a lot of water around their gut. They're known to have disrupted gut microbes, just like autism. And they also, there's an important enzyme in this mitochondria that work the energy that's deficient in these children, and it's an enzyme that's known to be suppressed by glyphosate. And again, you can take their gut microbes and put them into a mouse, and then you can basically produce a kwashiorkor type syndrome in the mouse by doing that. So I'm very interested in this disease because I'm suspecting it's sort of related to autism in a way, but when you have this extreme nutritional deficiency that's true there, but on top of that you have the glyphosate poisoning, then you get this different kind of nutritional effect that causes this serious illness. And here's a quote from this person who was the director of the African Center for Biosafety. It's a travesty that we're the only nation on earth where our staple food, namely maize, is genetically modified. Okay, next topic, cancer. And I think many of you know this, that WHO labeled glyphosate as a probable carcinogen? Have you heard that? Very recently, like in March. And this, of course, has Monsanto all upset. And they're assuring us that these people must not have known what they were talking about. Anthony Samsel, who's been collaborating with me on several papers, we're working right now on a cancer paper, glyphosate in cancer. And he has requested from the EPA a set of documents that Monsanto got the EPA to label those documents secret back in the early 1980s. And those documents described Monsanto's own studies of glyphosate exposure to rats and various animal studies, huge thousands of pages of this stuff that you can't search. So Anthony's been poring over this data trying to uncover the story, and he's been finding some very interesting things where they did some trickery, really. There was stuff in there that they knew indicated a risk for cancer, and their solution was to kind of argue their way out of it and then hide these behind a secret wall so that nobody would know. And so we're going to talk about this, what he's finding in this paper that's coming up. This was an initiative by Moms Across America. How many of you know about Moms Across America? Yeah, I really like Zen Honeycutt. And so they just took upon themselves to measure breast milk levels in nursing moms. And they found from 76 to 166 micrograms per liter, which is 760 to 1,600 times higher than the amount allowed in the drinking water in Europe. So, and urine testing has also been done in Europe. And here, her test came out 10 times higher on average than the levels they were finding in Europe. Not surprising because we have much more opportunity to be exposed to glyphosate. And then her point is that Monsanto is wrong about bioaccumulation. Monsanto says you get exposed, it goes right through, it goes out through the kidneys, and you're done. And in fact, Anthony's investigation into Monsanto's own reports is showing that that's not the case. It ends up in the bone marrow. And then it'll stay there and come out later and cause trouble. If it's in the breast milk, it's in the breast, and that might be causing breast cancer, which is interesting what's happening with breast cancer lately. I have personal friends recently who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. It feels to me like it's an epidemic. I haven't been able to get the numbers because the numbers on my database end in 2010, so I'd really love to know, formally what's happening since then. But this paper showed that glyphosate could stimulate, this is in vitro, you took these breast cancer cells, you added tiny, tiny amounts of glyphosate to them, parts per trillion, and they found that caused those breast cancer cells to proliferate. So that's basically causing the cancer to grow. And this is tiny, tiny amounts means endocrine disruption. Endocrine disruptors are really interesting chemicals because they are more toxic in tiny amounts than they are in larger amounts because they behave like a hormone. And hormones have their action at extremely low levels. So I think we're getting constant exposure to an endocrine, to an estrogen mimetic when we're eating glyphosate. And that's going to cause all kinds of issues like endometriosis and, of course, breast cancer and probably reproductive issues as well. So here's the plot of breast cancer over time that I got from the database on the web, which is available if anybody can get it, and looking from 1998 to 2010, and you can see that it was going down, 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 and then at 2006 it turned around and started going sharply back up again. So this is kind of an interesting trend and doesn't match glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops. However, it turns out that white women are susceptible to hormone replacement therapy causes cancer in white women, not blacks, but in the whites. And so if you look at just the white population, you actually can model this first part by an exponential decay. And so you could maybe hypothesize that our awareness that this estrogen replacement therapy is causing breast cancer has caused us to cut back on our usage of that, which has lowered the risk to breast cancer. So then you can just subtract that curve. You can extend it down and subtract it. And if you do that, then you get, with the remainder curve, you get a very good match. So there's a little bit of manipulation going on here, but it's plausible that this is what's going on. We took just the whites and we subtracted that model from all the data. And then this third graph is all the data, including the blacks. And then you get a strong match with glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops. So like I said, I would love to know what's happening over here, because that's going to affect us today. But this is highly significant with a p-value that's with several zeros after the decimal point. Very, very significant result. RoundUp is known to disrupt steroid synthesis. This protein star remediates the rate-limiting step in the production of steroids. Steroids are really, really important molecules. That's all the sex hormones, but also aldosterone and cortisol in the adrenal glands that are really important for hormones for controlling your behaviors. These things are severely reduced, 90% reduction by exposure to RoundUp. So I think the adrenal glands are going to be stressed by RoundUp, and we're seeing a lot of people with issues with the adrenal glands. This was a study by Seralini. It was the only study that I was aware of that studied mice, rats over their entire lifespan, which were eating GMO Roundup ready feed. And Monsanto's studies always stopped after 3 months. And Seralini said when he looked at 3 months, these rats looked okay. They weren't doing any obvious, they were doing fine compared to the other rats. At 4 months, you started to see divergence. You started to see differences. And then by the time they got to the whole lifespan, you saw a lot of statistically significant damage to the rats that were being fed the GMO Roundup ready feed. And this was basically, you got increased memory tumors in the females. The males had significant increased risk of tumors of the liver and kidney. Sex hormones were disrupted in both males and females. There was an enhancement of oxidative stress, which can lead to cancer, and very significant kidney dysfunction. And as I said, the effects didn't show up until 4 months. And these are some plots from Nancy Swanson's paper. I've been collaborating with Nancy Swanson. She's super. She's a physicist, retired physicist, and she was the one who first discovered all these plots that showed these strong correlations between all these diseases. And so she put this together in a paper that was published in the Journal of Organic Systems. I think that's where your paper was published too, right, Judy? Is that the same one, or is that a different one? Yeah. So, and she showed all these correlations with cancers. We have thyroid cancer, kidney cancer, liver cancer, and bladder cancer shown here, all going up in step with the glyphosate and with the use of the GMO Roundup Ready crops. Okay, species in stress. The U.S. Geological Survey study on pesticides in rainwater in Mississippi found, first of all, 2 million kilograms of glyphosate were being applied statewide in 2007 in Mississippi. That's a lot of glyphosate. And when they did these measures on the rainwater and in the air, they found over 75% of the samples tested positive for glyphosate and AMPA, which is a breakdown product of glyphosate. So this is really showing that it's in the environment. These are some species that are in trouble right now. Of course, we have the bees are dying off, the monarch butterfly is disappearing. These starfish in California are melting. They've got a really big problem with their skeleton. The bats in New England have a fungus problem. And the ladybug has pretty much disappeared. I used to see ladybugs all the time when I was a child. And then the frogs they're also disappearing. And they're getting all kinds of defects, you know. And so many of these have to do with fungus infection. And in fact, fungus is an epidemic that's causing extinctions around the world, but particularly in the United States. So the red here, fungus, is this red. And you can see huge amounts of fungus in animals centered in the United States. And in fact, even in the regions of the United States where there's very heavy usage of glyphosate on the corn and soy crops. And so I think glyphosate is causing these fungal infections. And here's a quote: "Emerging fungal threats to animal, plant, and ecosystem health in both animals and plants, an unprecedented number of fungal and fungal-like diseases have recently caused some of the most severe die-offs and extinctions ever witnessed in wild species and are jeopardizing food security." So there's this fungus that produces aflatoxin that has been shown to be enhanced. Its growth is enhanced in exposure to Roundup. So this is a paper that suggests a link between Roundup and the fungus. This toxin is really, really bad. Mutagenic, carcinogenic, teratogenic, that means it causes birth defects. Hepatotoxic, kills the liver. Immunosuppressive, you know what that means, and also inhibits several metabolic systems. So this stuff is really bad, and it's what's causing a lot of health issues, I think, in humans as well as in these animals. This is a paper that is about to appear in the journal Poultry, Fisheries, and Wildlife Sciences. This is collaboration with me and Nancy Swanson, I mentioned her before, and also Judy Hoy, who is just a delightful person we've gotten to know. She lives in Montana, and she spent the last few decades studying the wild animals there and finding all kinds of deterioration in their health due to the exposure to the pesticides nearby where they live. And this is just one example of many figures in that paper showing various problems with the eyes of various species that she captured through camera. And we showed then all kinds of correlations. Nancy Swanson does these correlations. We got all kinds of correlations with human issues, particularly infants. So we see a lot of diseases that are going up in the infants that match with the glyphosate. More plots like the ones she had before, but different topics. So you can check this out. So what can we expect looking forward if we stay the course? So first of all, we know this from Judy, GMO studies are worthless. But one thing really interesting that's just been published is a paper in PLOS One where they said that when they measured glyphosate in the feed of the control animals, they found it all over the place. First of all, GMO feed. They were being fed the GMO food, and it was contaminated with glyphosate. So what this means is that your control animal is getting exposed to toxic things that's going to cause things like cancer. And then what they say is, oh, well, that's just, these guys get cancer, what can we do? And then you've got this background noise, which is the cancer they're getting from the glyphosate, that you're comparing against whatever other chemical you're testing. So your chemical can come out looking great because it's being compared to this very low-dose glyphosate that has a high risk of causing cancer. So, they found Roundup in 9 out of the 13 diets, and 11 out of the 13 contained the GMOs that are grown with large amounts of Roundup. And so then they said it appears that much of the safety research underpinning the belief that GMOs are safe to eat is fundamentally flawed. Beyond all the things Judy said, it's hardly credible that this level of incompetence has existed within the science community for so many years. And it's much more likely that there has been a cynical acquiescence in scientific fraud designed to achieve desired results. Glyphosate-resistant weeds are becoming a bigger and bigger problem, and that's what's coming right behind the glyphosate-resistant crops. When you have the crops that don't die when you spray the glyphosate, then you use so much glyphosate the weeds become skilled at resisting it as well, and then you have to use more. So that's how you get this escalating use of glyphosate on these crops. An answer that they're now they're saying, well, these weeds are so bad we can't kill them with glyphosate. We've got to put something else on there. So now we've got glyphosate plus. We've got glyphosate plus 2,4-D or glyphosate plus dicamba, and they're designing engineered GMO crops to be resistant to these others. So we have these multiple resistance genes, 2 different herbicides, just like they put in different Bt genes, 2 different herbicides, and then they dump the 2 herbicides on the crop. And synergistic toxicity, I can't even imagine what kinds of new diseases we're going to have once we start being exposed to glyphosate plus these other toxic chemicals, which are considered by the industry to be much more toxic than glyphosate. And so here's a quote about Monsanto's new Roundup Ready Extend cotton and soybeans are engineered to be resistant to a combination of glyphosate and dicamba. And then we've got Dow AgroScience's new breed of endless duo corn and soybeans resistant to a combination of glyphosate and 2,4-D. So pretty scary stuff. Okay, taking action, this is the fun part. I think you know that in Europe they're starting to ban glyphosate. Only they're banning it for private use. They haven't gotten to the point of banning it for the crops, but they're making that step to not allow people to use it in their homes and things like that. And in fact, this one says the Dutch Parliament banned it, and it was following Russia and Mexico, which had already banned it. And then garden centers in France were starting to remove it, pulling it from their shelves. Brazil is considering a similar move, and it turns out even after this was done, July 13th, just a few days ago, France became. So countries are waking up. So Sri Lanka banned it and then retracted their ban and then banned it again. So this was after the WHO came out, WHO came out with this cancer prediction. And then Sri Lanka's new president, one of the first things he did was to say, we're putting that ban back in place. And so Sri Lanka and El Salvador and Bermuda, it turns out, are the 3 countries that have banned glyphosate outright. Organic sales are going up nicely, and this is something that the GMO community likes to, they've pushed these plots out on the web to say, oh, look, you know, organic correlates with autism. They're saying like, ha, 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 everything correlates with everything, organic correlates with autism. Organic food must be causing autism. You know, I mean, to me it's easy. Autism is causing organic food, because when people have kids with autism, the first thing they're going to do is say, well, maybe it's a diet, let me get this kid on a better diet. And the kids, not only the ones with autism, but the ones with ADHD and the ones with allergies, you know, food allergies, everyone's going to be saying, well, let's just try organic. And especially when it ends up working. And I have had so many people tell me, you know, I switched my child to organic diet and all of a sudden lots of things got better. I've gotten all kinds of email from people sharing with me their experiences. So this totally explains the correlation between autism and organic. And I'm really glad that organic is going up like this. In fact, you know, move over Whole Foods, Costco. I love the Costco in Kauai. We go in there and there's all kinds of organic choices. They've just, it's mushroomed on their shelves. The new king of organic groceries, Costco increased its organic sales by about $1 billion in just 6 months. Here's an activist in China, Tony Mitra. He's interviewed me, he's interviewed Anthony Samsel, and he's been tirelessly campaigning politically, trying to get change there. And he's trying to set up an opportunity for the Canadians to get testing for glyphosate, because he didn't have any way to do it. And so he's been working tirelessly along these lines. Just want to point out some of these people. There are many people like this. I like the Neil Young tour. You guys have heard about the Neil Young tour? Yeah, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, they kind of, I think they've got a Hawaiian presence, but he's touring with Jeffrey Smith, and he's got the Monsanto Years as his latest album. I'm really happy to see the music industry try to pick up on this message, because that's really a way to get it out to the masses. This is an article about Canada, you know, again, booming organic, and the push is on to get more organic growers. I mean, I think the farmers, when they switch to organic, are probably quite happy to realize they don't have to deal with these toxic chemicals, because they don't want to be getting sick. And so they appreciate it if they can figure out how to do the organic and make it work, and they'll get more money for their crop. So, so in Canada, they were saying 58% of the consumers were buying organic on a weekly basis, with strong demand for organic products. And Zen Honeycutt, I mentioned her before. I really like her. She and I have done talks together. She does a lot of things trying to get moms to help to campaign. And really getting the message out to the world is the critical thing, I think, right now. And she was instrumental in getting glyphosate tested in the breast milk. She does 4th of July parades. I mean, she interviews scientists. She just does whatever she can to help promote the message that we need to get rid of glyphosate. Richmond, California, this is a nice approach, is the city actually just banned Monsanto's Roundup usage on their public places. And so I think that's the first and only city to do that, but this is something more cities could do. And this could be a real grassroots movement going up from the cities, you know. Because, of course, what's happening is that they're controlling the top, and then they're trying to disenfranchise the bottom, and you guys are experiencing that too. But the county level here, there's been a lot of power at the county level. They've tried anyway, and I know they've gotten lawsuits and whatnot, but it's really difficult to fight this battle. But you can do it one city at a time, one person at a time, one family at a time. So now we're starting to get class action lawsuits. I think they're going to be huge once we can get enough evidence of Roundup's harm. This one's kind of fun. They're saying they lied on their label because they said it's not found in humans, but it is found in humans because it's this shikimate pathway that glyphosate disrupts, which is in our gut microbes. And so they're using this as a lawsuit to say it's false advertising on the label. But we're getting more disconcerting lawsuits coming because of the WHO, you know, saying cancer. So here's something I found on the web, some lawyers that are saying, you know, if you were diagnosed with these conditions like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is linked to glyphosate, maybe we can build a case for you. So I think as we get, you know, once we say autism, I mean, if we can get proof, enough evidence that it constitutes proof, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. I like the Outgrow Monsanto movement in Maui. And I think that's just a great message. You know, just find a way to do it right, and forget about trying to change. And don't maybe forget, but since it's so hard to change the political process, then just change the farming. You know, do it yourself. And I think that's just wonderful that you guys can do that. Bernie Sanders, I think, yeah. Yeah, and so it's really quite exciting how much momentum his campaign is building. It was interesting, I looked back and I saw in 2013 that he had put up a bill that would have protected the states from having their rights removed on their ability to label GMOs. And right now, of course, we've got this bill that's pushing through that's going to remove that right. So this bill, had it passed, would have prevented them from doing what they're doing right now. But of course it didn't pass, but he was the one who initiated it. So that's really a good sign. Hillary, of course, hired former Monsanto lobbyist Jerry Crawford to run her campaign. She's really deep into Monsanto connections, and that's always my last message. This is my kitchen table. We buy everything organic in our house, and I would encourage you to do the same. Right now there's no GM, you know, you can't avoid GMOs because there's no label, but it's better to go organic because you're also avoiding the chemicals as well as the GMO. So in summary, glyphosate is toxic. It's going to bankrupt the country due to astronomical healthcare costs. We can expect half the kids born in 2032 to be diagnosed on the spectrum, 80% of the boys because they are much higher risk. Obesity, kidney failure, breast cancer, gluten intolerance, some of these I didn't talk about here today, anencephaly, these are some of the things that are consequences of glyphosate poisoning. It disrupts biological processes through metal chelation, enzyme inhibition, disruption of gut microbes, many other effects. Many species are in distress due to glyphosate. People are waking up, and there are many ways to help get the message out. So we need to ban glyphosate from the market worldwide, and we need to return to sustainable organic agriculture.